Hello there. My name is Troy Kinsey, managing partner for Kinbalo Ventures. I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Paul Culver, a seasoned professional, service management leader who has led a number of organizational changes and led a number of service management teams. Today, we're going to talk about the human side of service management and share war stories, lessons learned, mistakes we've made, things we've learned from them. Paul, for those who don't know who you are, maybe tell us a little bit about your background and some of the teams and initiatives you've led.
Sure. Well, Troy, this is great. Thanks for introducing me. I know we go back a ways and have done some great work together in the past. So I actually originally came from the humble beginnings of a help desk back about 20 years ago is where that all started. And I've been doing IT service management for the better part of my career since then. I've touched on incident problem change, um, a lot of CMDB work, work for both in insurance and healthcare primarily. And some of the things that have led CMDB efforts where we improved data quality up to 90% in one organization, another where we took uh, the the dependency mappings for critical systems from almost 0% to about 50% in a 12-month period of time. I also did a lot of work on delivering major incident processes, doing a lot of training to countless teams on that, making sure we had alignments with the corporate goals. Also acted in a product owner space for service management. Service management's not really a product per se, but driving agile methodologies like Kanban, Scrum, lessons learned, making sure that the team had what they need to drive their individual efforts forward as they align with their goals. And so, doing all this over time, I've been really excited about communications, building business partner relationships, cross-functional relationships, and just seeing all the changes that have happened over the years in service management.
Fantastic. Well,
Yeah.
Paul, thank you for your time. And yeah, I've enjoyed it, our times in the trenches together. So
Yes.
definitely happy to
Yes.
hold this podcast with you.
It has to do with demonstrating that you're here to partner, asking them questions, listening to say what are some of the things that you would like to see, and asking about that, and knowing that you're not going to be able to deliver everything that they want to see, but having those ongoing conversations with them to say, hey, here's how we've been doing things up to this point, bringing data to the table around availability, communications that have happened in the past, the work that we're doing to understand customer bases, impacts, what our critical items are. And it is one of those things where you have to meet with them on a regular basis to demonstrate that partnership. And how you do that is just good old fashioned. Sometimes it's organizational change management. It's just relationship building. It's customer relationship management. And it's really all the things that are so important on service management. Because when I think about, okay, yeah, we do a lot of technical things, we roll a tool out, but do we have the right processes and expectations around them? Are we working with people to understand what their needs are and demonstrate that we're doing what we can to fill those needs?
That can be fairly challenging when you're working with an organization that's fairly large and where there's a number of service teams that you're working with in terms of identifying what those targets should be from a business perspective, and then partnering with service teams so that they're on board as well with, okay, so we understand where you're going. We understand why this is important from a business perspective. It's going to be a challenge for us to meet that, those timelines because XYZ, because our technology is such that it takes, we can't estimate how much time it's going to take or how much energy it's going to take to, get systems back up and running. The other part is the service desk itself. So I know you've had experience working with service desks in the past and helping to convince them that it is possible to get a number of days of MTTR, mean time to resolve, down to a matter of hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's several pieces to this. Working with the business, as you mentioned, the little C customer and the external customers, as well as working with the service teams that are ultimately accountable for their services, and then working with the service desk itself. And convincing them that, okay, so really from a business perspective, these are the numbers that we really should be achieving. And so let's figure out how we're going to achieve those numbers.
Mhm.
That's definitely a challenge. I know that um, because they all have their different perspective.
Yes.
Yeah, from a business perspective, most of the business units that I've worked with in the past are fairly reasonable. And this is a concern that I know service teams and the service desks typically have in terms of if we ask the customer what they want, or if we ask the business what they need, they're going to ask for an unreasonable number. And typically, I'm curious what your experience has been working with all three of those groups. One with the external customer, other with the business, actually four groups. The other with the service teams, and then ultimately with the service desk to figure out how they're going to achieve those, whatever those target metrics are.
Right. So one of the most important things to do is not go in with a blank slate. If you're asking what you need, I mean, I did touch on asking what you need, but there needs to be some caveats around that. Go in with a clear idea of the technologies that you support, knowing what's, coming down from a program standpoint, what the corporate objectives are, and coming in with alignments that way. And then being able to talk with them saying, okay, here's what IT has planned. Here's what the services that we provide. Here are some of the things that we do. Be very transparent about the metrics that we're going after. And then maybe you can get some ideas on how to tweak some of those metrics. And then talking to them about, historically, what are some of the things that have been pain points for you? What are the things that have been customer satisfiers or delighters, looking at that way? And then being able to, look at how do we lean into those a little bit more effectively. So a lot of it is understanding those different areas. And again, it goes back to organizational change management.
Mm-hmm.
You look at how would you speak to an external customer? Oftentimes, a lot of IT folks don't. It's usually typically through a vendor or other managed service provider. But that relationship can also with the external customer can be built with, for example, say workforce management team. It
Mm-hmm.
works saying what are some of the things that your our customers are reporting about, or what are the things that they say are not working very well on our website, or just being able to see certain things happen, process certain transactions, and getting that full picture and being able to plan accordingly around that. One of my favorite things to do also is really walk the floor. There's the old standby of doing Gemba walks,
Yeah.
doing Gemba walks. And what I've been really happy with, and I know the folks that I've been work with have been really happy with too. It's like, wow, this person, the service management person, this person from IT or whatever it is, they care. They're actually here, sitting down, maybe listening to a CSR take a phone call, attending their stand-ups,
Mm-hmm.
and say, said not that you would be embedded perpetually with them or being there as a person in every single meeting, but saying, hey, I want to listen to your stand-ups, your scrums, your planning sessions, whatever they are, and be a voice for you, and maybe take that back to the IT organizations or technical teams to understand a little bit more and be an aligned person. I mean, one of my favorite things that I did was that alignment. Having that alignment, I did it proactively in one organization I worked for, where I was talking with a lot of the CSR teams, and we reduced business complaints by about 80% just because of my presence there, because it was about getting them involved, being part of the process, understanding what is it that they need around not being on the back end when incidents happen, but being on the front end, understanding their impacts, being part of the communications, partnering with them, um, being aligned with, I mentioned earlier about capability product groups. I was aligned with some of those when I was doing service management for one organization. That included, for example, a billing team, a cybersecurity team, a data and analytics team, understanding what is it that you have that is vexing you, if you will. I see you've got a number, you mentioned about reducing MTTR from a number of days to a matter of hours.
Mm-hmm.
One of the groups I worked with, I looked at their P2 tickets and I said, we've got a trend here where these are open for a long time. Let's drill in, let's understand what are the configuration items or the recurring themes, and working with their leadership to say, all right, these are the drivers behind these long times to resolution. Can we get a prioritization? Because it may not be super urgent stuff. It may not be the big flashy exploding outages,
Right.
but it's the stuff that I like to say is maybe eating your lunch. It's taking time away. So maybe there are certain technologies, certain things that we can invest in, or retire using the Gartner approach of time for investing. Do you mitigate? Do you retire? Do you just divest in it, whatever it happens to be, and
Right.
making sure that you do that. And so through that type of effort is how we were able to reduce those times to resolve.
I think so. You mentioned two great points. One is several, but you mentioned the engagement. So, and getting an appreciation, helping IT or the service desk, service teams get a better understanding from a business perspective of what the impact is. So, I think Gemba is a great idea. Getting them to kind of appreciate what happens when services are degraded or they can't be used, what that impact is on the business side or the customer side, I think is an excellent point. The other is you mentioned engagement. So getting the teams involved and getting them thinking creatively in terms of what would it take? So one of the things that we've done with clients in the past is really getting the service desk, for example, involved in, okay, so let's go back and take a look at this ticket. So what could we have provided you so that it didn't take, X days to resolve? And once teams kind of break out of that mold of this is what we've always done, and once they start getting into that kind of problem solving mindset, it really does help. And they'll come up with, I've seen service desk analysts come up with really creative ideas in terms of how they can speed up or decrease rather MTTR. So, in terms of if I had access to the vendor, or if I had access to this information, or if I had the ability to do XYZ, then they would have been able to resolve it. All right, so let's figure out how we can make that happen. So I think you hit it on the head in terms of getting that level of engagement is really important for resolving a lot of these issues. It's not, as you mentioned, just one person coming in saying, all right, I have all the answers, but it's getting an appreciation and making sure everyone's on the same page in terms of we're not quite where we need to be.
Mhm.
And so let's talk about what that impact is on the customer, on the business, and then let's work backwards to figure out, all right, so what do you need so that you could actually, achieve those objectives within that time frame?
So Troy, you touched on something you mentioned about coming in pretending or not, not having all the answers. Um, it's very true. One of the things I've prided myself in is being essentially the glue between teams because a lot of service management requires who's that touch point, someone can help connect the dots between teams. And a lot of these teams understand that these are all very important things we need to do, but having someone there to provide oversight, to be a partner, to be an engager, it can happen in nuanced ways. And I know you like to use a lot of movie references, so I'm going to go ahead and use one on this. One of the things you've probably seen the series Band of Brothers, I'm sure,
Mhm.
D-Day and all the Eastern or the
Oh
European
yeah.
at that time. Yeah. So the one of my favorite, most memorable scenes is when they were in the shelling was happening in the woods, and it was Donnie Wahlberg's character. I think at the time he was a sergeant, but when he would, after it was over, he ran from foxhole to foxhole, just checking to make sure all the men were okay. So, how you doing? You did good. And it wasn't any groundbreaking thing that he was doing, but he was going through. It's kind of like going from stakeholder to stakeholder, saying,
Sure.
how is everything for you? Are you getting what you need? Is it okay? And I'm sure I'm paraphrasing the things that he was saying,
Sure.
but at the end of the day, he was it Lieutenant Spears, I think it was, basically told him, he didn't realize Donnie Wahlberg's character didn't realize what he had done, but he said, "Heck, it was you, Lieutenant, who held the men together." Then he got a battlefield commission. Now, I'm not saying it's out there looking for promotions or what have you,
Sure.
but the point being that if you can look at yourself as an engager across different areas and being able to understand where the gaps are, that's one of the nuanced things about service management that sometimes I think isn't always something that you can quantify, but you can tell stories and tell those compelling stories about. What constitutes a service, right? So
Mhm.
is it, how do we define it? Is it solid, scalable and fit for purpose to the organization? Uh, so that is to me one of the biggest things to get nailed down well. So a good example of that is I worked for an organization that came up with a concept of what they call their capability product groups. And what they did is they looked at kind of soup to nuts, what is it that our company delivers, right? From a customer standpoint, what are those things that we do? And I'm not going to get specific on what the company did, but I will say, for example, are things around, billing, processing certain transactions, web-facing items, things of that nature. Maybe other back-end corporate types of functions like our HR systems, what have you, and being able to bucket those accordingly
Mhm.
and saying, all right, our services are based on this. What constitutes a healthy service from that standpoint? What does that look like? Tying in closely to that, so if we talk about configuration management, so CMDB, everybody or most people know that's a configuration management database.
Mhm.
What does the content need to look like to support those services? And what are those aspects that all tie in around the all the infrastructure, everything that supports it? Do we have ownership around those? Making sure we have ownership and accountability, that information is kept up to date, that we have a way of being able to show the health of that configuration management database. Part of that was based on some of my experience of how we mapped our services, our dependencies. Do we look at that? Or we look at things that are complete? Are they correct? Are they compliant? Do we have all the other pieces tying in around business continuity, security, being able to be compliant around SOX and things of that nature? So being able to have those things in place, it's agreed upon, it's a partnership. One of my favorite things I like to say is, I don't like the idea of IT and business. We're all part of the organization's business, right? We all have a seat at the table to have those conversations and to partner and to come up with some agreed upon documentation of what that looks like so we can be consistent.
So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about defining those services and working with teams to set up a CMDB?
The big piece of that is going to the different parts of the org, the people who are owning those areas. So it's also between managers and directors of the different technologies, managers, directors, maybe even VPs of the business functions as well, and sitting down and mapping out what that looks like. So maybe looking at a value stream map, being able to look at, all right, what are all the functional components of these? What customers does it serve, both internal and external? Are there things we need to know about around privacy issues? What constitutes urgency and impact? It's one of the biggest things when it comes to SLAs and being able to deliver on effective response and mitigation of issues as they come up. I like to make sure that we don't conflate hair on fire with a sense of urgency. So truly being able to drive criticality and understanding what business criticality looks like. So sitting down, having those conversations, and tying it into corporate initiatives. If we want to get more streamlined or be able to develop our products, whatever it happens to be, does it all align accordingly? It's important to look at a couple of aspects. One of it is, certainly what are critical applications, but making sure that we have a definition of what criticality is, because oftentimes when you go and ask the customer what's critical, everything's critical. Well, then
Yep.
that means nothing's critical. So we're kind of reacting to everything in the environment, and it's not a most effective use of time and cost. So when I think about criticality, we've got applications or functions, but then there are other nuances, right? And so this is where it's going to come to the help desk agent, a knock or whomever else, or maybe an aligned service manager to be able to understand the nuances. So I think of things like if we can't get checks out the door, if we can't process critical transactions that a customer depends on. So let's say you're an insurance company, right? We can't process claims. That's going to be a big criticality. Maybe there's a specific financial impact beyond a certain dollar figure. And this is one of those things where maybe somebody internally has that information, they know about it and can report on it saying, we're going to lose $1 million over the next 24 hours, whatever happens to be if this doesn't get fixed, which also ties into kind of the growth of the issue, right? So you have something that now maybe it's priority 3, but if this continues to grow over the next 48, 72 hours, this is going to be a very critical issue. So we want to treat it as a priority 1 for now, knowing that we're going to mitigate and make sure that we get that done is taken care of as soon as possible. We just don't want to throw a process at it and say, well, it's not technically a P1, so we have a P3 urgency of getting that done within 4 business days or 2 business days, whatever it happens to be. Well, it's going to be worse if you wait that long. The other one too that sometimes is very nuanced, and I've seen many examples of this, is company reputation. Is the company reputation at stake? So that's in how that looks. You can't always document. You can give a few examples, but if I think of things like the website is down, or the website is for some reason publishing an older version or out of date information, whatever it happens to be, that's something you need to consider. There's also the standpoint of we have uptime. We're measuring uptime as 99.5%. That's our uptime. But if that downtime occurs, if we're meeting that SLA, great, everything's looking good. But is that of value to the customer if that downtime, when it does occur, even if we're meeting our 99.5%, occurs during a critical time? So, for example, let me talk about Nordstrom. If we've got our half yearly sale, our anniversary sale, which are their 2 big times there. If there's something down with a website for a small period of time, but you're still within the 99.5% uptime, that's still critical because the customer looks at it as that's a poor experience. They don't care that you met your uptime. It happened to be down at a very critical juncture.
Kind of thinking ahead in terms of automation and AI, the more that we can make it discrete, the more that we can kind of set those definitions in advance so that we can kind of automate the routing, automate, notifications and setting a bridge and whatnot, all those things that are typically associated with critical incidents. If we can define that up front, that these are critical services, and even these are critical services at this time of the year, is ideal. The challenge is that that's a challenge. The challenge is that that's not easy to do. And so one of the things that I've worked with clients on is actually trying to get that discrete definitions for which are and which aren't critical services, period. So these, and even, including that kind of time factor that for this time of the year, this is not automatic critical or not. So I'm curious what your experience has been in terms of working with clients to essentially establish that infrastructure, establish those expectations.
Yeah, so one of the things that you can do is establish a calendar, right? So make sure it's a calendar that everyone has access to. A good example that I've seen is, let's say we have a change freeze. And so we know that if somebody goes in to put a production change during a change freeze, there is an automatic conflict that's called out where maybe something pops up and says, this is a conflict that needs to be resolved before you can put this change in. And the big thing about that, Troy, is communication, right? Making sure everybody understands what those calendar junctures are, that they're following them accordingly. And when we have a prioritization model, we've got something documented in the KBs, something somewhere that everyone has access to. And this isn't just something used by IT. It's got to be something that's used by visible to really anyone to be able to look at this and say, can we, on a quarterly, annual basis, whatever it is, go in and make sure that we have all our parameters in place. What constitutes criticality? What are the scenarios? What are the scenarios, including timeframes, and making sure that those are agreed upon.
And that's an elegant solution because, again, that can be, you mentioned KBs, it can be included in KBs, but it also can be, not to keep kind of coming back to this, but it can be automated. So the more that we can kind of establish those expectations and ideally automate a lot of the process around critical incidents, the better. Because then again, everyone has the same expectations in terms of how they should react and what should take place when one of these services goes down, or any part of that infrastructure. The challenge that I've seen with clients, with a number of clients, is there's a tendency to there's a desire to make it subjective, because they're concerned. A lot of clients are concerned about um, making sure that it's in the hands of customers and analysts to decide on the fly. So moving from a very subjective, you know, we'll decide at the moment whether or not it's critical or not. There's a tendency to kind of drive to that. Now, once you've kind of worked through that, and once analysts and service desk leaders and customers kind of understand that, it actually is helpful to actually create that discrete model, and set those clear expectations, the whole world becomes a lot easier, because then we don't have to then there's a lot less, let's say, negotiation that needs to take place. And it takes a lot of the pressure, candidly, off of analysts and the service desk leaders. I mean, obviously, if a client or a customer rather, is insistent, the instructions that we always give is, if they're insistent, then we'll make it a P1 and we'll act accordingly. And then we'll figure out later, not on the fly, but we'll figure out later, was this really a P1? And maybe it should be in the future. So we don't do that kind of negotiation. We don't actually say no, but setting those expectations up front definitely helps.
You know what, Troy, I like that because when I think about, oh my goodness, a scenario that I've seen, I'm just going to tell a little bit of a story here. A scenario I've seen where, with one particular client that I worked with, they gave the option for somebody to propose a major incident. Well, that's great. And actually that's good because we want to be able to give people, empower them to say, hey, I've got this critical issue, and customers know their business. The downside is oftentimes we would see things like password lockouts or other things that, they just say, well, shoot, if I can pull the trigger, I'm just going to say, yeah, this is a 1-1, for urgency and impact. And so we had to do some mitigation there to dial that down. But to your point, Troy, I think the important thing is, and this is where some people get stuck on process. It's like, well, my instructions didn't say this, so we're not going to do it. Well, let's be flexible, right? Process flexibility is very important. It's guidelines, it's governance, it's suggestions. And like you said, if somebody is insistent, let's give them benefit of the doubt with the intent of partnering. We're going to learn from this, and then we're going to improve the process, because you can send out surveys, which is fine. As we know, most people are going to either tell you the super bad news in a survey or maybe tell you some good news, but it doesn't always capture all the nuances. So learning on the fly as these things happen, saying, all right, so we're going to go and do a post-mortem on this, understand what happened. How can we make this better? So number one, we're responding to you as we need to, and, is an appropriate response. And ultimately, is the user experience such that they see the value in the processes that we have, because we've been flexible, we listened, which is important,
Yep.
and we're showing that we care about making sure people get back and up and running. There's another piece of that too, is communications. And sometimes where I see the challenges will be around, who does it need to be communicated to? Because blasting to the entire company may not be the best option.
Right.
So you can set up subscription services. But I know one thing I've seen in a recent client that worked really, really well is when we had a couple different communications that went out. One of them would be more on the customer focus. So customer being customer little c, the internal customer, saying,
Mm-hmm.
here's what's coming out, here's what's happening, and describing it to in business functionality language. but also in parallel, having communication, a technical update that goes to IT that gives a little bit more information on servers that are down, what are the things that we did, the actions that were being taken from a technical standpoint to restore service. And then also going in on the portal and adding that communication as well if there's an outage that's occurring, so people have it coming from different directions. Also on that vein is being able to, if there are planned outages or there are changes that are being put through, and I'm talking about production changes, not organizational change management, because sometimes those get
Right.
conflated, is automating that through your tooling system, because sometimes you can actually do it where it touches a portal and you'll create an outage, a planned out, what kind of outage, it's a planned outage, it puts it out on the portal and it keeps it up there for the duration of when that is planned to be down, so people know what to expect. And the most important thing about communications is really coming up with a good template, right? What's happening, why this is important, any actions that you need to take, and what you can expect next. There's a lot of ways to do that, but if you have clarity in how to do that, keep it concise, especially timeliness of communications. There's a lot of pressure to get them out. Just want to make sure you're being consistent with that.
That's an excellent point as well. I think one of the things that we've tried to do in the past is simplify the communication so it's standard. So whether it's boilerplate, where the analyst just needs to kind of fill in the blanks. I've seen a number of clients where essentially the communication is made up. That's another one of those kind of made up on the fly. And so it puts a lot of heat on the service desk teams and leaders, because they need to figure out, how am I going to craft this? How am I going to craft this communication that makes sense? And I've also seen where senior leaders get involved in that because it's something that's going out to the organization. And so there's a lot of caution about, well, we can't have a frontline analyst create an email that's going to go out to the organization. So trying to, and setting up that, another partnership, setting up that partnership with the service desk so that there is some kind of template or something in place so that the analyst doesn't have to do a lot of wordsmithing. They can just state, for example, one of the things we've used in the past are impact statements. So it's, what happened, who's impacted, to what extent, and what are the experiences, and then put all that, just that one sentence. And we've actually boilerplated it down. So it's fill in the blanks. It's just essentially one sentence that states what that impact is. And that's essentially just dropped into an email or a tool like ServiceNow, so that they just need to fill in the blanks. And that takes a lot of the pressure off of the analysts and the service desk leadership, but it also develops that level of comfort and security with leadership and with organization communications teams, so they know that, look, all they're doing is they're using this template and they're dropping in that impact statement. So it relieves senior leadership and corporate communication teams from having to get involved in every single critical incident. So that's a great point.
That's important, because otherwise you have too many people coming to the table. And let's face it, these events are expensive. They're expensive, and they may not be what one organization called white dollars versus green dollars, where green is the hard money that's being spent versus white, which is a little bit more nebulous, but it's people's time. How much is a help desk analyst worth per hour versus a senior director or vice president? There's a big delta there. And if all those
Absolutely.
people are getting involved every time, then it becomes expensive. But I've seen things work well around using Microsoft Forms, pre-filled templates in Outlook that you can just drop down and make a selection. I've also seen work really, really well on CMD in the CMDB, is in your description, or if you have maybe a custom field or something that talks about impacts, what service does this application provide, for example? What customers, so internal and external, maybe business groups, so we can identify who those are. And then also, what does it mean if it's down or degraded? And so there, to your point about having impact statements, if you have that information there, you just go and look for it, grab it, do a little wordsmithing and send it out. Eventually, those are one of those things that, as we get better with AI and other automation, we can actually grab some of that stuff to pre-fill those comms.
Sometimes in organizations, there's a need to have a different process when it comes to security, cybersecurity. So it doesn't go through the normal channels. So for example, if there's been a breach, that there's a separate process set up in terms of notification, communications, who gets um, who gets brought to the bridge. So I'm curious what your experience has been in the past in terms of working that out as a part of the overall critical service or
Yeah,
service
yeah,
process.
absolutely. So it all comes down to putting together process flows around that. I've done a lot of exercises with, getting with disaster recovery, business continuity, security areas, saying, all right, so what are the example things we need to ask, questions we need to be asking throughout the incident? Is there evidence of A, B, and C? Well, if there is, then what is the next decision? Who needs to come in and be part of that to say, oh, yep, we need to get involved in that? And maybe in some cases it becomes a handoff where the major incident team steps away from doing, for example, the communications, because maybe corporate communications and legal have to step in and say, have very, very specific language that it's not a bash at all on the major incident team, but they have to put some safeguards around it to say, what can we share out to everyone so they're aware of what's happening, but just give them just enough information to have an understanding, but not reveal too much. And that in the major incident team is still very much involved in the bridges and everything else going on, but it's just understanding those situations, maybe doing some tabletop exercises and having clear documentation. One of the recent organizations I worked with worked very closely with security, and this individual gave me a whole bunch of great scenarios. Like, here are the things to look for. Let's wrap this into your major incident process. If this happens, you need to engage these different areas.
So it's just something to be considered and integrated into the overall process. Another example that comes to mind is disaster recovery. So oftentimes there's a whole separate process from major incident management that's not focused on IT. So keeping those in mind in terms of considerations when building out that process. What are the other touch points or as you mentioned, those scenarios that need to be painted out so that everyone's on the same page. So not everything is created equal, but at least it's documented. And I think the idea of simulations is fantastic so that, we're walking through examples or scenarios or use cases so that everyone's on the same page in terms of how it's going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key, Troy, is documenting it. So what was it? If the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in battle, right? It's always one
I
of my
love that.
favorite sayings. Yeah.
Love it.
So I remember working with one organization where, yeah, BC and DR and security, and we documented these things ahead of time. The what ifs, right? The what we like to call the smoking hole situation. The buildings is gone, it blew up, something happened.
Yep.
Um, in those circumstances, and maybe are there certain senior leadership folks that have a satellite phone or whatever it is, certain people who will get engaged every time, and there's agreement that, okay, if it hits this threshold, here's who we're going to engage, and making sure that we've got that in place. So if something happens, we've got that peace of mind that it won't be 100%, but at least know what actions that we need to take.
And I think that's a great point as well. I think that even running through those scenarios, so it's oftentimes in helping teams understand kind of what their role is and running through those simulations or scenarios. I think part of that is just having them think as a team
Yeah,
and come up with those, what if scenarios and come up with how are they going to respond. Oftentimes those aren't the scenarios that are actually going to happen that they're going to find themselves facing. But the simple act of actually going through those simulations and scenarios helps them think as a team, helps them think
mm-hmm.
and solve issues as a team. And so if they haven't had the chance to do that, if teams haven't had the chance to kind of run through that and think collectively, then they kind of come in green, even if they already know what to do. So if they've had an opportunity to at least run through simulations, um, essentially do that kind of stumbling and that fumbling around offline, then it makes it easier when they, are faced with a situation that they might not have thought of.
Exactly. And to me, let's say for a critical incident, major incident, a facilitator's role is not to have all the answers. And I think you touched on something that was very important about collectively solving problems together. You need someone who can help drive that and ask the questions and get input and get feedback on what's working, what's not. What are some of the things that we need to do to help drive the issue forward? A little bit more at a micro level, because we were talking about disaster recovery and some of these other things and documenting those. One recent client I worked for was we had a run book that we put together, and I engaged. We had one particular part of the organization who drove one of our key products that we manufactured, and so they were kind of they were I hesitate to say frequent flyer for incidents, but because it was one of the most visible and customer centric items and very critical to our operations, they were a frequent flyer, but it was an opportunity to create some great partnerships. So we had, we would have Teams channels that we would engage in. So my questions to them were, okay, let's get here, talk about your critical applications. Let's get these listed out. Here are the critical applications. In these circumstances, who would you need to reach out to? What are the DBA teams, the application teams, other areas? When do we ping the certain business partners to say, hey, we're having issues with this? Are you seeing any reports? Just to let you know that we're working on something. So it was kind of this yes, no. It was very simple but put together, but it was a nice list of, all right, here's as much as we can about this space. And I got to tell you that the business partners were ecstatic. They loved it. And this is where relationship building comes in, because they said, wow, they want to understand what makes us tick, how we operate. And they gave us, scenarios, what's important to them, what's maybe a little bit less important to them. It's not quite as urgent. And through that, I would guess, my goodness, we probably had at least a 50% reduction in misengagements. And when I say that, because there would just be this kind of default ping of a certain team on Microsoft Teams to say, oh, can somebody assist with this? Not our area. Oh, can somebody assist with this? That's not our area. It's these people. So it's like, all right, this is obviously having an impact on you. We want to make sure that we're not playing, kind of the boy who cried wolf here, but that we have some, some semblance of when do we engage and when do we not. And so putting this run book together was awesome. So I'm not saying there has to be a run book for every single item, but it also goes back to what you have in CMDB as well, is document that stuff, understand the impacts, who needs to be engaged and who owns it.
I think that's really important. Completely agree. I think also, I think emphasizing, I would emphasize that whole running through simulations, especially with service teams and technical leads that aren't necessarily used to having that role, or analysts that have been assigned to act as incident commanders that don't have that experience. Running through those simulations, I think, is really important. So they get a chance to start getting more comfortable with making decisions and leading those incidents as they occur. And I think the other important point of that is empowering them. So once walking through those scenarios with them and identifying those areas where they're not comfortable or they have questions. And a lot of that comes down to most of those challenges or questions that I've seen that those folks that are not used to running critical incident bridges comes down to communications. So that's where they start fumbling in terms of, how am I going to communicate this out? So empowering them with tools, as we were talking about earlier, empowering them with tools and the ability to get out communications without a whole lot of, for example, wordsmithing or understanding where those need to be sent to ahead of time, and running through those simulations, I think is critically important.
I know. And Troy, I got to pause a bit on communications, because let's admit that is a huge stress point. I mean, trying to facilitate is one thing, and it's it's not a common skill set, and it can be taught, but there are some personality and sort of personal traits that go with it too. So just simply throwing incident management to a team that maybe they're really good being heads down, hands to keys with certain things, and maybe providing some updates, but wrangling the personalities. Even in some scenarios where I've seen a senior leader be told, hey, you know what, let me focus on this. I know this is important to you, but I need to get this done before something further breaks, because we want to put this in place. It's a very gutsy thing to say, but not everybody's confident to say things like that. So
Yep.
I think what a very big future focus is understanding the automation of communications. This is where having your items captured in CMDB and agreed upon is so important, where we can just get to the point where we can push a button, send a communication out, and have it be fairly close to being accurate as
That's
much as
awesome.
possible, or at least descriptive, giving just enough description of what's happening, and documenting things as they happen, and being able to demonstrate where we are with the situation. Let's say you have a point of sale system, and I'm just kind of
Yep.
making something up here, but if it goes down, is pencil and paper a workaround? Yes. Is it an acceptable workaround? Ooh, if it might be our only workaround, but it's not sustainable. So you have to have those conversations with the impacted area saying, here's what we believe is a workaround for now. Are you okay with this? If it's the only thing that we have, we're not going to call it resolve, but we're going to say, in the interim, here's what you can do.
I think that's another excellent point. So business continuity. So it gets down to gets back to the partnership again.
Mhm.
So setting those expectations with business partners as you just pointed out. So what is an acceptable workaround in working for a large healthcare organization where you have a lot of these where everything needs to be documented and tracked,
Mhm.
and you have these 50, 500 seat contact centers. And when one of those goes down, sure, they can document, but it takes literally hours and hours and hours to retroactively get all of that back into the system. So it's, as you mentioned, it's not always acceptable to just document or just, and so from an IT perspective, they might view it as from an IT perspective, they might view it as all you need to do is document this. But yeah, understanding the impact from a business perspective is definitely key.
And impacts aren't just bookended, it was broken, now it's fixed. So I think that's an interesting one that you bring up, Troy, about documenting and the time spent catching up.
Hmm.
I've seen a number of situations like that where maybe the customer is actually satisfied because they were still able to capture information. Maybe they didn't have access to information because the system was down. I'm not going to go too far down a rabbit hole with that one, but part of the resolution said we've resolved the issue. We're back to business. However, from a cost standpoint, we had to spend X number of hours going and retroactively putting the data back in. That is something that needs to be considered about the impact of an incident. And so that's also the cost of an incident. We know that maybe certain systems are they cost us thousands of dollars per minute that they're down, but there's also the nuanced cost of staffing time, putting information back in, recovering databases, rebuilding, restructuring, whatever it has to be. And that's where that business continuity piece is so important. Or do we have high availability across our critical systems? Are those systems, are we running Windows 2012 on some servers? I know some organizations, might have those, and those are some of the things you need to look at as
Yep.
opportunities. Let's just scour through anything that's, X number of years out of date. Let's making sure we're putting that in the pipeline as something we want to prioritize. I had a close colleague I worked with who said that in his career, he had implemented three, maybe it was four CMDBs, but truly only one, maybe two of them were successful. And successful in terms of, because they are big, gnarly animals. There's so many different moving parts.
Yeah.
So that wasn't a negative. It was just demonstrable the fact that it is a tough hill to climb. So the most important thing is asking yourself, why are we doing this? Why are we standing up? What are the layers we want to peel back? And start simply. Define what is a configuration item. What are the things that we need to discover, right? Because sometimes sometimes discovery is very easy on on-prem servers. Maybe cloud discovery needs some specific permissions to be able to do that? What teams do you need to talk to make sure you're getting that? Are we a company who's taken on legacy systems from mergers and acquisitions? How are we discovering that information? So the discovery piece is going to be huge because it's very easy to go in and manually create items. But if you don't have discovery set up correctly, that could be very, very difficult. And then the management of CMDB, right? You want to make sure you have clear ownership from the standpoint of who's the technical owner for the application. What does that mean? Who's the business owner? What does that mean? Who is responsible, accountable, informed, what have you, on the RACI, on how this is going to be maintained? What are the things that we need to automate? So it's really coming up with a roadmap for what does success look like with a CMDB. And one of my favorite phrases, don't boil the ocean. There's so many things that you could go after, but keep it focused, keep it consistent, and build on it and demonstrate what that looks like. Are there things that we need to look at from the standpoint of technologies that we need to retire? Are we discovering things out there that are very, very old that need to be updated or just simply removed from the environment? But looking at that, understanding how items are mapped, understanding what applications reside on different pieces of infrastructure, that's always a big challenge. So you just have to look at that one step at a time. And then what vendors can we partner with to help with that? And I won't name vendors by name, but I know that we've had some good work in some organizations with vendors who've come in and help us with some of those. For example, for those who have expertise in ServiceNow, you've got your in-house developers, and you also have folks that can provide some insight as well. And what modules, and I'm kind of getting into some other things too, but they all tie back into CMDB. What modules do we want to turn on and why in the app, for example, in ServiceNow? So what do we want to speak to around software asset management or hardware asset management? What are the dependencies there? So as items come and go from the environment, how are we tracking those? Are we showing that those are up to date? Are they assigned to the right people, the right teams, things of that nature?
So how do you go about selling the value of a CMDB?
That's a great question, Troy. So the value of that, there's depending on what the organization is going after. I know one organization, it was simply a governmental mandate after some issues had happened that required that we had data in place and we could demonstrate what was there. The value proposition, I think, for CMDB is our ability to understand our critical systems. What is supporting those critical systems? What are all the moving parts around those? Can we recover quickly? Can we make assessments on future state, what that needs to look like? Do we have things in place that show what our servers and our landscape looks like, things that are moving to cloud, things that are maybe still out there that need to be supported by a vendor? Do we have all our vendor pieces in place, and are they on-prem, off-prem? What are things that are web-based? And being able to understand what our overall landscape looks like. There's a lot of things from a value proposition standpoint, but a lot of it is as projects roll out, initiatives roll out, we can quickly look and see where the moving parts are, the folks that need to be engaged who own those areas, and be able to make more rational decisions on data.
In terms of maintaining a CMDB, ideally, a lot of this is done automatically. You mentioned discovery. I know that part of it is something that in the past we've integrated in with change management, so that the service teams essentially that becomes an integral part of putting in a change, is what are the impacts to the CMDB? So what has your experience been in the past in terms of how to make that as simple and, for lack of a better phrase, digestible as possible?
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with how are your changes set up? What are the questions that you need to be asking? And I'm not a big fan necessarily of customizing forms, but I know we did some form customization in one organization I work with to be very, very specific in our risk assessment, what information we were looking for in the different fields within the change form, and having kind of that prompt to saying, here's some examples of what this needs to look like. Here's how you fill this out. And then making sure that the CI that they select is a valid CI, maybe also forcing them to, I don't like to use the word force, but requiring that the
Sure.
configuration item field be populated as part of that change so we can see what things are happening there. And then making sure that are they, is part of the SDLC, that life cycle, is this a retirement that's happening? Making sure that we have a task as part of that, that maybe it gets automated in their backlog as like a ServiceNow task. I know I keep going back to ServiceNow, but I've used that quite a
Sure.
bit. That it signs to them as saying that you're going to submit a request to retire a CI. And so then you have to go in, making sure everything is decoupled, it's put into a retirement state, making sure those updates are happening. The big one too is rollouts. So let's say we've got a big project that's happening. We've got a new product that's coming out. One of my favorite ones I worked on with a recent client was a machine that it's like a large vending machine, if you will, that pulls pieces and parts together for product that they manufacture and send out the door. It's a really cool thing. It was just a huge thing that sat in the warehouse. But I said, let's talk about that. What are all the components of that? We don't have anything in the CMDB yet, so we need to stand that up. What are the dependencies going to be? What's the description of that? Again, like I said before, what happens when something goes down or
Right.
it's degraded? What areas depend on it, and financially, how does that look? And making sure that when you do have those rollouts, that part of that planning includes not only the knowledge-based items, documentation, but also that CMDB piece as well. What are all the components that comprise that item?
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that gets back to your earlier comment about selling the value of a CMDB to teams so they understand that this isn't just you creating documentation or going through a process for process sake, but essentially this is helping you at the end of the day, help support your service.
You know what it is, Troy? Source of truth, right? A source of truth. People don't like to chase down emails, chasing down something that might be on SharePoint, something that was scribbled on a cocktail napkin somewhere. They like having one item. Now, of course, there are going to be some other tools that are out there, and maybe it becomes an aspect of, are there API calls? So if something gets updated one place, it gets updated in ServiceNow, vice versa. Making sure that all the groups that are involved in the documentation have a seat at the table and they're all participating.
Helping to teams understand kind of what the value is that they can achieve from a true change management process, and what that essentially that's an internal service that provides value to you and provides coverage. It provides oversight that can help service teams avoid getting into trouble, not not politically, although that too, not politically, but trouble in terms of putting something in place in a production environment that might impact other critical services or that might impact customers, and making sure that customers are aware, and all those different facets that are part of a true solid change management process is something that typically takes a bit of tooling to get to.
It does. It does. And out of the gate, and we could probably have a good, healthy change management conversation at some point, but
Let's do that.
it's record keeping, right? If something has happened, with one of the first things in a major incident process, or really in any incident process, and this is something that a report that should be available at any time to any service desk agent, anybody in IT, anyone at all, to say what changes occurred in the last 48, 72 hours, right? One of the first things we looked at, what changed? If something changed in the environment, do we have that captured? It helps also tremendously, I've seen, from a project management standpoint. This is one of the recommendations I always have is, let's say you have your smart sheet up, Microsoft project, whatever it is, those line items and the different ownership. Oh, do we have a change in there? And actually, can we just go and hyperlink it back to the change that's in the tool and say, did we do this? And somebody says, oh yeah, we delivered that piece, or we did that thing. Like, okay, check it off. Well, maybe they didn't, or maybe wasn't completely successful. If we have that in our tool of record, again, we have something that was delivered as part of the project or it's in progress, project manager, whomever else, any stakeholder can go and look and say, oh, we demonstrated that we have items in the backlog that are associated with this.
So Paul, thank you for your time today. Really
Sure.
appreciate it. Great discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Troy. I want to leave on this note. I think one of the things that's important to remember with service management and anything from a skill standpoint going into the future, not losing sight of the people aspect. So I would think it's familiarizing yourself with organizational change management methods, getting your emotional intelligence skills up, negotiation, conflict resolution, just not turning on modules or implementing technology just for the sake of doing it, thinking you've got a technical solution to everything without having the right level of governance around it and training and people understand how to use it effectively. How are we going to measure it? And then one thing too is, oh my goodness, it's just a matter of what is a customer experience. It's not just service level agreements. Maybe it's experience level agreements. And this is something I read on LinkedIn recently.
Oh,
It's really
interesting.
coming down to how does a customer feel about what it is that we're providing? Did we just turn on a technology? Did we, implement? I mean, everybody's been talking about AI for some time. Is the AI working? I just got up today with a going round and round in circles on a automated AI prompt agent that was trying to help me with something that was just not answering my question. So
Oh
making sure
boy.
that whatever parameters you put around that, that it's meaningful. It's meaningful to the customer.
That's yeah. We could have a whole discussion around AI, the pros, the
And we should
cons,
as
the
well. Yes.
pitfalls. We should
Yeah.
actually. Yeah, that would be great. I think you just answered my last question, but what advice would you give to a service management leader, consultant going in for the first time and working with a new service management organization?
Wow. So I think one of the first things to do is go in and listen to what's pained them over the past. Listen to what the things that delight the customers. Understand what the company does. What is it? What are their services? Do they have those defined? And also, are they kind of disseminating what each person's particular expertise is? Maybe it's in change management. Maybe it's in incident management. Maybe it's in communications. Can you go in and actually assign or align certain skills and different traits with the different folks that are on those teams? And I would also make sure that give them the opportunity to go in and align themselves and have conversations with the different stakeholder groups. That's one of the most important things. And I'll tell you a quick anecdote too. If you're concerned about spending hours and hours in documentation, we did talk a little bit about AI. Use some of that because there's so much documentation out there that can be scraped from the interwebs. You can start with that as a template, maybe whether it's using Chat GPT or what have you. There's plenty of good documentation out there. And then make sure you edit and scale it specifically to your organization so you can get back to the business of building those relationships and keeping customers happy.
That makes a lot of sense. I completely agree. I think going in and talking to, you mentioned various stakeholders, I think representatives from all different facets. So everyone from the service desk analyst to the business to service teams to leadership and customer. The more that you can get kind of everyone's different perspective, I think the better.
One tool I'll tell you really quick too is I put together, I believe it was the first in IT at one of the companies that I was working with, is it's basically just kind of not so much a flow chart, but an organizational chart, right? And it looks at it was called a key role map, and it's part of the AIM methodology. And so it basically chunks out all the different parts of the organization. You break it down, whatever little symbols and colors you want to use. And that way you use it as sort of a heat map of who are the areas that might be resistant, who are the areas that are embracing, who are the areas that haven't been talked yet. Maybe they're kind of grayed out. And that way you can look at the entire organization and get everyone focused on going through that cultural change. Because a lot of that's what it's going to be. And it's going and understanding the culture. How can you, in a very healthy way, help turn
Right.
that dial to get to the next step? I've seen unhealthy cultural change where it's very forced, where there's in some cases almost threats, that's never sustainable.
Where
So
it's what? It's
where,
almost
where
what?
it's never sustainable when you do it, take that approach.
Yeah.
People are led by maybe fear and intimidation for only short bursts in a crisis, but not for long-term healthy relationships.
I would completely concur. I think helping teams understand the why, and I think getting an appreciation for each of the team's perspectives or each of the key stakeholders' perspectives, I think is critical. And I think that there are examples where teams have gone in and they have the answer, they're kind of the pre-made answer. And I agree with you. If teams don't understand the why, and if they are not engaged to come up with the solutions, then they're not going to be as motivated.
Make them
That's
part of the process. They
part of
show
the
how they contribute. Make them feel good about what they're doing. It's not just something that's prescriptive. It's something that's collaborative.
that they can achieve. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Troy. Really
Appreciate your
appreciate
time.
it. And we will talk again soon.
All right. Cheers.
All right. Thanks.
You bet. Thank you.